So I'm very happy that the library is able to partner with Transition Town, Port Washington on tonight's program. I think one of the parts of the library's mission is to provide a forum for programs like this. I think the issue of climate change is so important, and providing educational awareness is something that the library is committed to. I think whether you've been paying attention to the news or just watching the weather outside, I think for all those who are here, you understand its importance, and I'm glad that the library is able to provide that forum tonight. So I want to thank Juliana Littman, Margot Galbraith, Claire Brazell, and Chris Holmes from Transition Town, Port Washington, and also thank Shandu Visweshvaraya from Cure 100 for guiding the presentation tonight. And now I'll turn it over to Juliana. Take it away.
Thank you, Jeff. Good evening. My name, as Jeff said, is Juliana Littman. I am actually a member of Transition Town Port Washington Steering Committee. I'm so very glad all of you were able to join us this evening. Thank you so much for taking the time. I wanted to start with a very brief introduction of Transition Town Port Washington and our relationship with the two webinar partners here, the Port Washington Public Library and Q100, before I hand it over to our speaker for today's event. Transition Town Port Washington is part of a global social, economic, and environmental movement whose mission is to organize and promote a community-wide effort to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and transform our peninsula here to a sustainable economy. We got started in 2019, just before the pandemic, and are really your friends and neighbors dedicated to environmental protection and climate action. We are 100% committed to a 50% reduction of fossil fuel increase on greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 and a net zero by 2040. If you would like to join our mailing list, please go to our website, transitiontownpw.org, or use the chat function right now to share your name and email address with one of the panelists. Just direct chat them. Working together is our mantra for all we are doing here at Transition Town. We are making collaboration part of our mission and are striving to work with a community partner for all our actions and events. The Port Washington Public Library is one of our trusted events partner. It is always, always a pleasure and privilege to work with Jeff Say and his colleagues to bring you events like this evening's webinar. We are so very happy that our library has made climate and decarbonization education part of its mission. But Transition Town Port Washington is not only partnering with local organizations. To reach our ambitious environmental goals, we joined and are now a chapter of Q100, which stands for Communities United to Reduce Emissions 100%. Q100 is a not-for-profit consortium of communities that, like Transition Town Port Washington, all seek to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2040. The local and global communities that are part of Q100 share resources to support each other in taking action to stave off worst effects of climate change. It's the least we can do, I guess. The impacts of the changing climate on all of us have unfortunately become all too clear over the past week. The transition to a net zero future is what we think no longer optional. And we believe that reducing our own and our community's carbon footprint through thoughtful personal choices is a responsibility that we have to accept. But before we start on this journey, we need to know our current footprint, to have a benchmark and know what we are starting from. And that is exactly where Q100's Carbon Tracker app we are introducing here this evening comes into play. This app will show you where you are today, and you will learn ways to reduce your carbon footprint in the future. Shandu Visweshvaraya, who is joining us here this evening, is the Vice President on the Q100 Board of Directors and co-founder of Quote 100. Shandu has a very impressive professional resume. He's the founding president and CEO of Utopus Insights, a global renewable energy software company headquartered in Valhalla, New York. Prior to his current role, Shandu led a worldwide smarter energy and environmental science team at IBM Research. In 2013, he was named IBM Fellow, the highest technical honor conferred by IBM for his work in semiconductor chip design automation. I'm really humble, Chandu. Chandu lives, not besides all of that, Chandu lives a low carbon lifestyle in a zero carbon house that he and his wife built in Croton. We are so very glad to have him here this evening to learn from him. Chandu, may I hand it over to you?
Thank you, Juliana. Appreciate it very much. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for the kind introduction. Thank you to Transition Town, Port Washington, and the Port Washington Public Library for hosting this event. As Jeff said, this session will be in two parts. There'll be a formal presentation of about 20 minutes, followed by a hands-on demo of, again, about 20 minutes. So the presentation will be in three main parts. We'll first understand the problem of climate change, as though anybody needs to be reminded. And then we'll talk about the imperative of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade. And then we'll conclude with a remedy, which I will argue is within our grasp, and in fact is our personal responsibility. So let's begin. We all know what the problem is. The skies have become our open sewers without limit, and we live in one of the dirtiest countries in the world as a result. The resulting greenhouse gas concentrations are causing myriad problems and quite literally killing us. Now, how much are we emitting? Across the planet, we are emitting 50 gigatons or 50 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent every single year. As we all know, these greenhouse gases are warming the globe and causing all sorts of environmental damage. Depicted here on a map of the globe are some environmental tipping points. So what is an environmental tipping point? These are threats that we face whereby if we tempt fate just a little bit too much, there's a very real chance that the phenomenon will gallop away out of our control. So to help you make sense of this chart, I'll classify some of these threats for you. One of the most imminent threats is number one on this chart, which is that our coral reefs are getting bleached and they're collapsing everywhere, no more so acutely than off the coast of Australia. Of course, we all understand that there's melting ice due to the warming of the ocean waters in the Arctic, in Greenland, in the West Antarctic, but also in the tundra and the Himalayas. Forests are getting destroyed from Brazil to Russia to Canada. Our own human actions are not exactly helping either. Our weather is very much determined by ocean currents, and we are causing profound changes, everything from the El Nino Southern Oscillation to methane belches in the Sea of Japan to an Atlantic Ocean that is both more acidic and more oxygenated. Ladies and gentlemen, we are playing with fire here, and none of these impacts is hypothetical. Scientists have precisely calculated the probabilities of these tipping points depending on how much warming we allow to occur. In other words, we are sowing seeds today for a horror show that has started but will gather steam later in this century. So let's jump into the 1.5 degree centigrade imperative. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, is the United Nations body that is charged with studying climate change. As such, they are the gold standard of top international scientists coming together to conduct studies, reach conclusions, and warn us of what we need to do. And they have been crystal clear. We must limit warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade. Let's understand why. Here's a quote from the IPCC special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees issued in 2018. Limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade requires rapid, far-reaching, and unprecedented changes in all aspects of society. So every one of us needs to sit down for a minute, look in the mirror, and ask ourselves, what am I doing that is rapid, far-reaching, and unprecedented? One of the main themes of that IPCC report is to explain that there is a big difference between 1.5 degrees of warming and 2 degrees of warming, which, by the way, was the original Paris Accord target. The answer is very simple. We are playing a game of high-stakes roulette with environmental tipping points like the ones I showed you before. In this chart, what I've taken is from the IPCC report, 3 of these tipping points: coral reefs, Arctic summer ice, and coastal flooding. And the intensity of the color coding shows the level of risk as we permit more and more global warming rise. The trouble is that these very scientific plots are not very intuitive. They are hard to understand for most people. In order to help us understand this, we invented a game. So it's time to play a game called the Wheel of Misfortune. So this is how the game goes. We have a 1.5 degree centigrade wheel on the left and a 2 degree wheel of misfortune on the right. And they have different segments with good and bad outcomes. Your coral reefs could either be saved or get completely bleached. Sea level rise could either be contained or become catastrophically high. So let's give the 1.5 degree centigrade wheel a spin and see what happens. Oh, great! We saved the day. Sea level rise is not as bad as we thought it would be. Let's give it another vigorous spin. Oh, yay! We preserved Arctic summer ice. Give it another spin. Oh, the coral reefs are saved. So while we take risks with 1.5 degrees of warming, the probabilities of those risks are relatively low, and the mitigation against those risks is doable. Now, if you look at the 2 degree wheel on the right, you don't have to be very observant to notice that the probabilities of catastrophes are really stacked against us. The red sectors are like the gray hair on my head, increasingly abundant every year. So let's give that a spin and see what happens. Whoa, some bird species got extinct. Give it another spin. Let's see what happens here. Oh my goodness, goodbye Miami Beach, goodbye Venice, goodbye Nauru, Marshall Islands, maybe Chicago. Give it another spin here. Oh no, we're gonna have ice-free summers through the Arctic. You can take a sailing cruise through the Arctic once every 10 years instead of once a century. So you know what? Spin, baby, spin. Every time we increase our CO2 emissions, we're taking ever-increasing risks with serious environmental tipping points, which have serious catastrophic consequences. We are literally playing with our future. In just the last 2 weeks, if you're paying attention to the news, you witnessed what happened in Oregon, in China, in Belgium, in Germany. Even the most inland city of Chicago is suffering from climate change. They all drew the short straw in the wheel of misfortune. And by the way, a little memo to the West Coast. We don't need your forest fire air to blow here and spoil our air quality. We spoil it all by ourselves. Thank you very much. So seriously here, here's a question for you. You get the 1.5 degree wheel, but you hand your grandchildren the 2 degree or 3 degree wheel. Is that really fair? So humanity faces a really stark choice at this point. We could continue in our naive hubris, burning fossil fuels in a business as usual scenario. Carbon will keep rising, probably to about 600 parts per million in the atmosphere, and we will face an unimaginable catastrophe with about 4.5 degrees centigrade of warming. Or we could implement all the current policies that are on the books, and carbon emissions will stay roughly steady at the 50 billion tons per year number. And warming would end up at about 3 degrees of centigrade by the end of the century. Or we could trust that all countries will implement all of their pledges and targets, and we would be able to further reduce warming to 2.7. Or if all so-called Paris pathways are implemented, achieving net zero before the end of the century, we will limit warming to about 2 degrees centigrade. And here's the key. If we want to avoid the shop of horrors we saw on the previous page, we must cut carbon faster to limit warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade. This is the only option out of the 5 on this page that requires us to cut greenhouse gases in half by 2030, as you heard in the introduction. There is no wiggle room and there is no time left to wait. So just to summarize what we've learned so far, we're burning a lot of fossil fuel, 50 billion tons of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere every year. That's going to lead to 4.5 degrees of warming unless we take action. The IPCC is clear that we're tempting fate on tipping points. We need to limit to 1.5, and that means we need to cut in half by 2030. This requires rapid, far-reaching, unprecedented changes from every single one of us. So here we are at the announcement of what's now being called the Earthshot. So President Biden, on Earth Day, April 22nd of this year, made an announcement that the United States will cut its greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by the end of the decade. Of course, this invites comparison to Kennedy's moonshot from back in 1961. Both are ambitious goals with an end of decade deadline to achieve them. Now, of course, there are a few little differences. One was made by our youngest elected president and the other by our oldest elected president. But actually, there's a very, very significant difference between these two. Not only is Earthshot superbly ambitious and superbly important for the future of the planet, it will involve every single citizen, every ordinary man and woman in this country. Because if Earthshot is to be successful, our lives will change profoundly. The kind of cars we drive, the buildings we live in, the appliances we use will all change. So can we really do this? We come now to the fun part of the presentation, now that I've thoroughly depressed everybody, which is the remedy. There is hope. We can do this. We can band together. We can educate ourselves. We can take action. We can feel good about this, and we can overcome this problem yet again. So let's talk about the remedy. At this juncture, please allow me to talk for a minute about Cure 100, which is the not-for-profit on whose board I serve. The will to change for us is manifested in this not-for-profit that stands for Communities United to Reduce Emissions 100%. It's a consortium of communities, including Transition Town, Port Washington, aimed at decarbonization by grassroots activities. The 100 in Cure 100 means we want to tackle 100% of the emissions economy-wide, touch 100% of the people and businesses, and 100% of municipal operations. And we will do so by working with everybody, as Juliana described in her opening. So what is the goal of Cure 100? It's an extremely simple goal. We seek to walk down this stairway. We seek to reduce our emissions as a community from its baseline amount in 2020 to net zero in 2040 in 20 easy steps of 5% each. This is all about carbon reduction. So if reducing carbon is our singular goal, do we not need to know the baseline amount of carbon? Should we not be able to measure and quantify carbon? Do we not need a currency that we understand for carbon? If you had diabetes but no way of measuring blood sugar, what are your chances of controlling the disease? If I asked you to manage money but you couldn't tell a $10 bill from a $100 bill, what are your chances of doing it correctly? So what we need here is carbon literacy. What is 1 ton of carbon? What does it mean? How much is a car? How much is composting? How much is my waste? What we need, therefore, is carbon literacy. If you're not literate in a subject, you're not going to be able to master that subject. And how fitting, we have all come to a public library to improve our literacy. This is so fitting. So let's get right into it. Cure 100 has published a simple 7-step program to achieve a low carbon lifestyle. The average household in Port Washington has a carbon impact of 59.5 tons of CO2 equivalent per year. Wait a minute, that bears repeating. The average household has a carbon impact of 59.5 tons of CO2 equivalent per year. So what's a good number? Well, we need every house to get into the single digits. That's a good goal for us in the short term. Get yourself to single digits. The 7-step plan is exactly that. It's a step down. And this notion of step down, you're going to see it woven through all of our materials, our plans, our carbon tracker. Everything is a step down the carbon ladder. None of these is a huge step. You don't have to all go out and buy Teslas or heat pumps. There are many, many small little steps that each person can take. And that's exactly what this model gives us. So step 1 is to attack electricity. This is 5 tons on average of easy, low-hanging fruit. Therefore, very easy ways to cut carbon from your electricity use. You can sign up for a clean energy supply company. You can sign up for community solar. You can get your own solar panels. You can sign up for community choice aggregation. It's really low-hanging fruit for us to get that part to 0. Step 2 is to attack transportation, which is the biggest contributor at 17 tons. My goodness, that's painful. And what we'll see next is that you don't have to take one big giant step. You can get a more efficient car. You can use a little more public transportation. You could go to a hybrid or plug-in hybrid, and ultimately, of course, to an electric vehicle. Step 3 is to insulate your house, electrify your building heating and cooling with heat pumps. Step 4, reduce food waste and maximize a locally sourced plant-based diet. Your health will thank you for it. Practice recycling, practice composting. Step 5, give carbon a seat at the table when you make decisions on goods and services that you consume. Step 6, get involved in your community and reduce public carbon use from streetlights and schools and houses of worship and so on. And finally, there are ways to offset any remaining carbon impact in your life so you can get to a true net zero or even a negative carbon lifestyle. Think about what a cool party line that is to open a conversation. I live a negative carbon lifestyle. Isn't that cool? So, let's get to the demo next, right? So the first step towards carbon literacy is to really understand your own carbon impact. Cure 100 has developed a software application called the Carbon Tracker. It's available for free to all of you. It's available through the Transition Town Port Washington website. I'll show you that in just a moment. It helps you determine your own household carbon impact. It allows you to compare your carbon impact to the average neighbor in your zip code. And it gives you tips and suggestions on how to build a step-down plan for yourself. So I'm going to demonstrate the carbon tracker with a hypothetical sample family that we've created. It's a family of 3. John commutes to New York City. Jane sells real estate. They have a budding environmentalist teenage son, Tom, and an obligatory dog, Spot. They live in a 70s contemporary and own 2 cars. And with that, what I'd like to do is switch to the demo. Let me turn it over to Jeff to see if there are any pressing questions we can take before we jump into the demo.
Sure. Thank you, Shandu. I'm just in the middle of putting a couple of the links into the chat for folks so that they will have those. And then there was one question, I believe it was answered. So just give me 1 sec to get this last link into our Zoom. Okay. So those links are there, and you're going to, I'm sure, be referring to those as you are demonstrating right here. One of the questions, again, you answered, which was, what happens if we just stay with, business as usual? What type of temperature increase are we going to see? And I have to say that those options slide was a very powerful one. Illustrates it very clearly. I did want to, I'm just going to check in case there's any other questions there. In terms of the partners that Cure 100 has developed with different communities, can you give us an idea what number that is? Like how many other communities have decided to partner with Cure 100?
Absolutely, Jeff. Real quick on the first question, if we practice business as usual, we are predicting somewhere between 560 and 600 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. Anything above 350 is not safe. Today, we are at about 417. The rise in sea level could be in multiple meters. I mean, so every coastal city in the world will basically disappear. It is unthinkable havoc that would happen if we continue with business as usual. To answer your second question, just permit me to give you a tiny bit of history. A little over 2 years ago, we started a not-for-profit in the tiny little village of Croton-on-Hudson, New York, where I live. It was called Croton 100, and it was all about the carbon tracker and reducing carbon in our community to net zero by 2040. And we would run campaigns to get people to use the carbon tracker. We would run campaigns on EVs, on heat pumps, on improving insulation, on community solar, etc. Surrounding towns and other communities got interested and wanted to work with us so that we could share best practices. And frankly, our voices get louder as well when we band together. And so towards the end of last year, we launched Cure 100 as an umbrella organization. That's a consortium of communities. And we set up what's called a collaboration agreement so we can work with other communities to collaborate. It's all about collaborating. And that way, if the world's foremost heat pump expert lives in Port Washington or the world's foremost EV expert lives in Croton, we get the expertise of these people to apply in all of the communities. And I'm really happy to say that we've only been in business 7 or 8 months. We have 6 chapters already. Yorktown 100, Ossining 100, Transition Town, Port Washington, Phillipstown. We even have 1 chapter in India that wanted to join us. So it's a great question, because if somebody's on this call and not from Port Washington but wants to join us, please get in touch with us and we would love to have you join.
Terrific. We did have one more question here. I missed the beginning, so perhaps it was already addressed, but if the rest of the world does not strive for the same goals, will the US actions have any meaningful effect? I think this is certainly a common question that people do have about climate change.
Yeah, it would be a real tragedy if we're the only ones. The good news is that some of the other bigger emitters like the EU and like Japan and like China and India are making their pledges as well. But we should also keep in mind that historically, in the 120 years of fossil fuel emissions, we have been the biggest emitters by far, right? And so we have an obligation, I think, to lead and to reduce our emissions as fast as we possibly can. But absolutely, we need the rest of the world to join us, and because carbon anywhere is bad. Right? So it's a global phenomenon and it needs to be cut out everywhere.
Jeff, it's Bob. I received two questions.
Sure, go for it.
One is, can you explain tipping point? What exactly does that mean?
Yeah. Terrific question. I'm so glad somebody asked that question. Please thank that person for me. So a tipping point basically means that you keep pushing the limit until you get to a point where there's a positive feedback loop and you simply cannot recover. And I'll give you an example. When the permafrost in normally frozen areas of the world melts, it turns out that it releases methane. That methane is a powerful greenhouse gas, and it increases the rate of warming. That increased rate of warming melts even more ice. That releases even more methane gas. And now you've gotten into a feedback loop that you have no control over, and that's a tipping point. Another example, of course, is that if the permafrost melts so much so that it exposes the brown earth underneath, then what used to be a reflective surface with high albedo is now a surface that is absorbing more of the sun's heat. And so it speeds up the warming and even more ice melts, and there's a tipping point that's gotten away from you. So in short, a tipping point is a positive feedback loop that gallops away from you and there's no way you can control it. And the badness just happens at an amazing speed.
Do you have another question, Bob?
Well, actually, Shandu just addressed that second question
Okay.
about the ice. Yeah.
Okay. And I have, let's see, two more. What, if anything, do we need to be mindful of regarding any adverse effects of ramping up electrification so as not to regret our ways all over again?
Yeah, great question. So electrification in general is a very good thing because it's a more efficient way of getting work done. So if I want to drive from place A to place B, the electric car is 3 to 4 times more efficient than an internal combustion engine. If I want to heat a space or cool a space, using an electric heat pump is 4 times more efficient than doing it with fossil fuels. So there is goodness purely in the efficiency, but that's not enough. That electricity must come from a clean source or a sustainable source, right? So as long as we pay attention to efficiency and we get that electricity from clean sources, then we're doing the right thing. And in fact, it's the only way for us to get out of this mess and still essentially retain the lifestyle that we have. So we should not do this blindly, and simply burning coal and getting electricity and using it to run your electric vehicles or heat pumps doesn't really solve the problem. That electricity must come from a reliable, sustainable, inexpensive grid. And we have to solve that problem as well.
Okay, thank you. One more question. I think this will lead us hopefully right into the app itself and the demo. Do you have an opinion on carbon credits versus carbon taxes? Does your group anticipate that with your carbon tracker, you might issue carbon certificates where some members compensate others?
Yeah, that's actually a very, very big question, and we could spend the next 2 hours debating credits versus taxes. A lot of economists have said that the only way we will actually solve this problem is with carbon taxes. And you're already seeing in the Senate that there are some proposals that if goods come to our country from other countries that are not taking proper care of the environment, that they will get taxed. That's one form of a carbon tax. Nobody wants to hear the word tax. And so you can do the same thing with credits and say, if you use solar panels or community solar or EVs, you get credits. And you don't get those if you go with the fossil fuel, but that's another way of incentivizing things. They're all legitimate mechanisms, Jeff, to incentivize us to get over the hump of new technology and start embracing the new way of doing things. But ultimately, all problems are economics problems, right? And so the wind, solar, EVs, heat pumps, they all need to get better, cheaper, faster, more convenient in order to take over the world. And we have to make that happen. And we have to lean in and adopt those technologies so that they get better and they start to get mass manufactured and it catches on. So The economic aspect of it is a very good question. The good news is that all these investments pay for themselves over the lifetime of that equipment because they are typically cheaper to own and operate.
Yeah, thank you for answering that question. Before you begin with showing the demonstration, I want to mention two things. One is that in terms of electric vehicles, we actually worked with Transit Solutions, an organization here on Long Island. They had a couple of experts who spoke about electric vehicles. We did record that program. It is available on the library's YouTube page. So if you have some interest in electric vehicles or have some questions or curious about it, please check that out on the library's YouTube page. Secondly, after tonight's program, if there are individuals here watching this program, if you speak to someone who is wanting to complete the Carbon Tracker app or work on the Carbon Tracker app, certainly encourage them if they would like to come into the library. We have public computers that are available on a first come first served basis. And then I have sent along some instructions with some of the basic information in terms of the website and the types of information that you will need to have in terms of the make and model of your car, your annual electricity usage, et cetera. So our computer lab staff will have that information and be able to assist people if they come in, and certainly in the next few weeks. And honestly, that's what they do. People come in and need help with something. That's part of their job. But in this case, we've given a lot of the specifics to them. So I would encourage anybody who maybe doesn't have access to a computer, or if you know someone who is needing some help with figuring it out, certainly encourage them to come into the library. So I'll turn it back over to you, Dushantu.
Awesome. Thank you, Jeff. Can you just confirm with a thumbs up that you can see my browser screen? Beautiful.
Yes.
Okay. So folks, we're going to take a quick tour through this software called the Carbon Tracker app. And for those who are looking at your watch, I know you need to get to dinner or kids or whatever. I'll make sure I get the demo done by 8 o'clock, so 17 minutes roughly, but I'm happy to stay and answer questions after that. All right. So you notice all I typed in the search bar was Transition Town, Port Washington 100, TTPW 100. And the first thing that comes up is, of course, the Carbon Tracker app, most important thing. So Google got it right for once. So you click on that, that takes you to the Transition Town, Port Washington webpage. It talks about your carbon footprint, our path to 2030, our climate journey, and it says get tracking. When you click the get tracking, you get thrown right into the Carbon Tracker. And if you have Google credentials, you can just log in with Google and it'll use your Gmail or YouTube credentials and put you in. If you don't have Google credentials, you can either establish one or you can make a user ID and password just for the use of the Carbon Tracker. A lot of people don't like one more user ID and one more passwords, in which case you can just use your Google credentials. Pardon me for 1 second where I turn off my admin privileges and make myself an ordinary user. Okay, here we are. So this is the front page of the Carbon Tracker app. You see this little symbol here. This is the Decarbonizer Bunny. That's our little mascot, and that's a sign that you can get online help. So if I click on the bunny, you'll see that this is your friendly Decarbonizer Bunny with help on the home page of the Carbon Tracker app. So anywhere you see the bunny, you can just click on the bunny. The bunny will give you help on that little item that you're dealing with. And there's plenty of online help available should you ever get stuck. When you look on the top, there's 3 simple tabs here: Profile, Questionnaire, and My Carbon. Profile is where you establish your own profile. And among other things, we need to know your zip code so we can give you correct carbon calculations and correct carbon comparisons. Questionnaire is where you answer a few simple questions about the cars you drive and how much electricity you consume, etc. And My Carbon gives you your results. It shows you your carbon footprint. It allows you to compare it to neighbors, and it gives you help and suggestions and tips to decarbonize. So let's go look at profile. I've already completed my profile, just my name, Since I'm the bunny, I put down 100 Carrot Lane, and I'm in Port Washington, 11050. The zip is very important, right? Once you're done with that, you go to the questionnaire, and the questionnaire has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of these pillars. We call them pillars. Those are your sources of carbon: transportation, electricity, and so on. The idea is that you fill in the answers to some simple questions in each of these 6 pillars, and out comes your carbon baseline. I'm going to walk you through this very, very quickly. And in general, when you see green, it means you've answered a question fully. If you see something red or pink, it means you have not yet answered that question fully or completely. So in this case, this particular family has a 2018 gas vehicle, which is a Ford Explorer. It's driven 15,000 miles per year, and the miles per gallon is 19. If you don't know the miles per gallon of your car, here's a handy dandy website where you can look up the miles per gallon of any model of any car. Now, as soon as you enter this information and click on save, it'll instantly calculate for you the carbon impact of that car. All these carbon numbers are in tons, metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. Why do we say carbon dioxide equivalent? Most of your tailpipe emissions are carbon dioxide, but there's also some sulfur dioxide, nitrous oxide, nitric oxide. They're also greenhouse gases. Each gets multiplied by its badness factor and combined with the CO2 to give you one equivalent number of the tons of greenhouse gases. In this case, it's a little bit over 7 tons for this Ford Explorer. Now let's just do a quick thought experiment. Suppose I could get by with a plug-in Prius Prime, let's say, instead of this Ford Explorer. Yes, it's a slightly smaller car, very comfortable. It gets miles per gallon that's in fact well above 100. And why is that? That's because the first 25 miles you drive are purely electric, and then it switches to gas only for trips that are longer than those number of miles. So if you're only driving short trips, then you get infinite miles per gallon, right? And if I hit save, your 7 tons gets reduced to 1.3 tons. So right there in the calculator, you can do a what if when you're buying a car and give carbon a seat at the table when you make your decisions. You like a red car, you like a fast car, good for you, but look at the carbon as well before you buy that car. So I'm going to put this back to 19 miles per gallon and hit save. And by the way, when you like any other menu, if you have a Tesla, you can just type a T, and when you type T's, it'll take you through all the things. So it's very, very easy to use. It's like standard menus that you might use. And I'm going to set this back to Ford. Here. Now, very quickly, vehicle number 2 in this case is a Toyota Camry. It's driven 10,000 miles. It's a more efficient car than the Ford Explorer. It gets 26 miles per gallon. And look, it's 3.4 tons of carbon. What is this family doing wrong? They're taking the inefficient car and driving more miles on it, taking the efficient car and driving less miles on it. Right there, there's some low-hanging fruit that they could reduce. Now, let's go to flights. Now, flights are particularly harmful to the environment. They emit greenhouse gases at a high altitude that causes damage. And the way we calculate the carbon impact of your flights is to ask you to estimate how many flight segments your family uses in an average year. Now, because of COVID, last year was wonderful. For many of us, it was 0 or close to 0, which is great. In the case of this family, it's a 3-person family that goes down to Florida to see grandma once a year. So that is 6 flight segments. And this is economy class short. There's also long and super long. And you can see the little help segments here. There's a short video here that helps you understand how to classify your flights. So notice, we're not asking you from which airport to which airport. We're not asking you what type of plane. We've made a simple enough model that you tell us roughly how many flights you take, short, long, economy, business class, and we'll do the carbon calculations on average for you. Now, if it were just these 6 short flights, it's 2.4 tons of carbon. Okay, that's not that bad. We know that one of their cars is 7 tons. Okay, in comparison, that's not so bad. But the gentleman flies, let's say, business class for a conference or for a company meeting twice a year to Australia. So that would be a super long business class, 4 flight segments. And look at the carbon number. It's now 2.394. I hit save, and where does it go? It jumps up to 26 tons, right? So you get an idea how much carbon there is from these flights. And of course, in business class, more of the carbon of that plane is assigned to you because you're sitting in a seat that takes more space, right? So there's a formula by which carbon gets allocated. Just to wrap up on commuting, maybe you have 220 round trips per year into the city. Maybe you're using LIRR or you're using subway number 7. It's, let's say, 30 miles round trip. I don't know how far it is from Port Washington. Maybe 35 is closer. And I say save. And look, it's just 1.1 tons for all of this commuting. Anytime you use public transportation options, you are saving a ton of carbon. And compared to driving, you're saving 1.83 tons by using the train. Now, we went through transportation in some detail. I'll go through the rest of the pillars much, much quicker, but you get the general idea. You answer a few easy to answer, common sense, simple questions. The carbon calculations are done for you instantaneously. So let's go into heating. There's a few questions about what type of heat you have. And then we come to the oil section. This particular family uses 1,200 gallons of oil per year for their furnace. It asks you what % of biodiesel is mixed into that oil. At least here in Westchester County where I live, 5% is the minimum. You must mix 5% biodiesel into the oil. And when you do that, you see the total carbon is nearly 12 tons. And that 5% biodiesel is saving you about a half ton. Now, in many, many parts of Westchester, and I'm sure this is true in Long Island, you can ask for B10 or B20. In other words, your oil company will supply you biodiesel 10% or 20% blended into that oil. And if you had B20, look, your carbon went down by a full ton compared to B5. So this is a low-hanging fruit of 1 ton. If you simply pick up the phone, call your oil supply person and say, I would like biodiesel B10 or even B20, right? And that's a very real option for a lot of people. So this family uses natural gas for cooking. It's only 80 therms of gas. You can give me your gas usage in either therms or cubic feet or hundreds of cubic feet. You have to refer to your utility bill and get the correct units when you put this in. But 80 therms of gas leads to just less than half a ton of carbon. Compared to the heating, the cooking gas is really small, right? So again, the carbon tracker helps you understand what are the big hitters and what are the little ones that maybe you can give it a pass or deal with it 3 years later or deal with it 5 years later and attack the big ones first. Propane, this particular family uses it just for grilling. Let's say they use, 2 20-gallon canisters per year. It's 40 gallons, so it's 0.225 tons of carbon for it. Now, notice it also asks you if you have a wood stove or a pellet stove, but it will not charge you carbon because this is a natural substance that absorbed CO2 during its lifetime, and now you're burning it, which is not ideal, but we're not going to charge you carbon for that use of that wood. Electricity is a very easy tab to deal with. We ask you to tell us your utility, which is probably PSEG Long Island, and your electricity supplier, because these days we can choose that independent of the utility. And we simply ask you, how many kilowatt hours do you use per year? If you have any trouble, see this question, how to determine your annual kilowatt hours? Click on more, you get a nice big detailed description. How do you deduce it from your electricity bill? You get everything explained for you right there. So in this case, this family uses a fair bit of electricity, 11,000 kilowatt hours per year, and that's just shy of 7 tons of carbon. Not as much as their transportation, but a significant piece. The one that gets a lot of attention is food and waste, because we all like to eat food and we'd like to know what the impact is. The waste modeling is very, very simple. We charge a certain amount for waste. This is to pick up your garbage, transport it, and either incinerate it or hopefully incinerate it and not put it in a landfill. But this is sort of more of a national average of carbon impact from waste. And then we give you credit for recycling. So if I said, no, I don't recycle paper products, I don't get the credit. If I say yes, I get 130 kilograms of carbon dioxide credit, or 0.132 tons. Similarly, cardboard, metal, plastic, glass, composting, and so on. And then you get a net total carbon. Now here's the interesting part, which is diet. And diet has a lot to do with your carbon impact. This includes the use of the land to grow food, the use of the land to grow food to feed to cattle, the processing of the food, the transportation, the cooking, the waste. All of this is included when you tell us what your diet is. And this is based on studies done by the FDA and other organizations. Now, let's say just to use a stereotype, let's say the dad in this case is a red meat lover and has a reasonable number of meals with beef and veal and so on. And I'm just going to hit enter to save and look at the carbon from his diet. It's 3.3 tons per year. Now, let's say the wife is on a meat diet, but is not a red meat eater and is on a no beef diet. And her impact is just 1.9. And let's say the teenage son is newfangled on a vegan diet, his impact is just 1.5. And you start to realize that one big red meat eater is about the same carbon impact as the other two people in the house. And so if you were willing to do a meatless Monday or a vegan Wednesday, which you can model in the tool, by the way, just watch the video, it'll tell you how to do that. You'd start to see the tons in your impact going down. Last but not least, goods and services. We all buy goods and services, and all of that has a carbon impact, right? And if I bring the painter over from the next county, then that person's driving their truck every day. If I can get a local person, that's a lower carbon impact, et cetera, right? And the way we do this is that we have statistics for the average carbon impact from goods and services in zip code 11050, which is just shy of 12 tons. And then we ask you, are you an average consumer or are you a bigger consumer? Are you shopping more? You have a bigger house, you have a bigger car, and we allow you to use your own judgment. There are some carbon trackers that ask you for your annual income. We didn't want to go in that direction at all. And let's say I'm honestly a little bit higher than average, and you see that it charged me a little bit more than the 12 tons of carbon. It just upgraded that by 25%. And finally, we have zip code overhead, over which you seemingly have no control. These are all the public uses of carbon in your zip code. You get charged, in this case, 5 annual tons of carbon dioxide, but you can get involved and get your school to get electric school buses. You can get involved in your church or your temple, get them to use heat pumps. There's funding available to do things like that. You can get involved with your municipality and get LED lights on all your streets and your buildings. So much that we can do in the public sphere to lower this. Now I'm running out of time, so I'll go real quick to the My Carbon. Now that we have completed the questionnaire, here is the big result, which is my carbon. The first row is the total. The green bar is my carbon, and I'm at 80 tons based on all the answers that I've provided thus far. And by the way, the average Fort Washington household is at 59.5 tons, as we learned previously in the presentation. So, geez, Louise, I'm 30% more than all my neighbors. Shame on me. What can I do, right? And then you look at the bars and you say, yeah, heating, electricity, food and waste, I'm kind of average. And look at this enormous bar called transportation. Well, let's go zoom in on transportation. And again, in my carbon, you have the same pillars that you saw in the questionnaire. So you go to transportation and it breaks it down for you. This is my train, this is my flights, this is my first vehicle, this is my second vehicle. And it's clear as day, it's my flights. And by the way, my company offers carbon offsets for any business travel. All I have to do is ask, and I can get rid of that bar. And by the way, if you scroll down on any of these pages, here are some ideas that may help you. Low cost and effort, medium cost and effort, high cost and effort. And here is the step down chart for this pillar, down to a sedan, a hybrid, a plug-in hybrid, or an electric. We'll take one more quick look and then wrap this up. Maybe I'll take heating as an example. And there's my propane, my natural gas for cooking, and there's my heating oil. I'm not doing so bad. Frankly, the whole zip code's not doing well, but compared to that, I'm not doing so bad. And I can come down here, get a number of tips for me to do better. And further, I can look at the step down where I could go from an oil furnace possibly to a natural gas furnace, which we do not advise because gas leakage is very dangerous for the environment, to a propane furnace that is more efficient, but ultimately we all need to get to electric heat pumps for our heating and cooling, right? And then a very interesting step down in food and waste. This has to do with our dietary choices. And for a meat lover, you see how high the red bar is for the meat portion, the red meat portion of the diet, less so for an average meat eater, none of that for a beef eater. And then the vegetarian cuts out even that piece, and then the vegan cuts out the dairy as well. You go from 3.3 tons all the way down to 1.5 tons. And if you could do this even 2 days a week consciously, right, that makes a significant enough difference for you to go for it. So I promise to be on time here. So let me wrap up with just a couple of quick remarks. This is easy software for anyone to use. There's plenty of online help built in there. It's free. You can go to the library and get help if you get stuck or you'd like a computer at which to bring this up and play with it for yourself. Once you establish a profile, it will remember your answers when you come back the next time. So this could be your constant companion for the next 40 years, the next 20 years until you get to net zero. So folks, there is no excuse anymore. Educate yourself about climate change. Make a pledge to cut your emissions in half in this decade. Make a concrete plan for how you will do this. Use a carbon tracker to quantify that journey and feel good as you make progress. Thank you for your patience, and back to you, Jeff.
Thank you so much, Shandu, and thank you for demonstrating obviously I think a very effective tool in terms of what you described at the beginning. You need to be able to measure it in order to be able to take the appropriate action. One quick question, we do have a couple here in the chat I'm going to get to. In terms of the average for 11050, how were those calculations made? I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, great question, Jeff. So as I kind of mentioned at one point, Jeff, we have accessed many different databases. One of the important ones is that UC Berkeley did a study in 2014 trying to understand the carbon impact for each of these pillars for each zip code in the country. We combine that with data from eGrid, for example, which tells us that if you're using 1 kilowatt hour in different zones in the country, what is the carbon impact of that 1 kilowatt hour? And it's quite different in Montana than it is from Virginia, than it is from New York. And let me tell you, this software works in all 30,000 zip codes in the country. So if you have a cousin visiting from California, hey, take the carbon tracker, put in your zip code, you'll get correct answers from it. So what we've done is to basically take the miles driven which comes to us from the Berkeley database. We sometimes adjust that based on census numbers, and then we use physical constants to convert that into gallons of gasoline and then get carbon from it. We get e-grid numbers to convert kilowatt hours into carbon, right? And so we basically mangled and wrangled multiple databases to make this kind of comparison available. Let me just be clear, right? This is not meant to be exact to 5 decimal places, right? But that's not what we need. We just need to be directionally correct. So this is giving you broad averages for your own carbon consumption, broad average for your zip code. It helps you to calibrate, and it helps you to make a plan to reduce.
Great. Thank you for explaining that. So a couple of questions here, not necessarily about the app, but just, again, related issues here. What do you think of carbon capture technologies as a way of addressing the problem?
Yeah, so I don't know if any of you have read Bill Gates's recent book about the climate crisis. He describes what's called a green premium, right? So for every ton of CO2 that you either avoid or remove, how much does it cost you? And it turns out that with today's technology, sequestration of carbon is very expensive. Right? So unless somebody has some great breakthrough that makes it economical at scale to do it, it's not the #1 way that I would advise. Now, by just switching your car, mending your diet, not wasting food, improving your insulation, almost for free, you can save 1 ton here, 2 tons there, 3 tons here, etc. So when you look at it from a personal point of view, these are no-brainer things. It's just things we've not paid attention to in the past, right? When you look at it from a macro point of view, getting people to electrify their loads and getting that electricity from solar and wind is the cheapest way to avoid a ton of CO2, right? So getting EVs to be more popular, heat pumps to be more popular, this is what we need to do to hit the low-hanging fruit. Now, once we come to 2035 and there's only 5 years left, and we're attacking the hard problems like how do we make cement and how do we do mining and what about air travel and so on, perhaps at that point sequestration may become competitive in cost. But today it's kind of prohibitive. It doesn't mean we shouldn't do research and find good ways to do it. It's great. Keep in mind that forests are a very natural way of sequestering carbon, so we should practice good forestry and regenerative farming. These are all very, very good things to do. But just to give you an idea, you could plant 50 trees and wait 20 years till they're fully grown, and then you would be absorbing 1 ton per year. And look at all the other ways we have of achieving 1 ton, right? So put things in perspective and look at the numbers. And to me, this business of I want to keep burning fossil fuels and drive big cars and take my boat for a cruise, and then I'm going to sequester this carbon somehow so I can keep my lifestyle, just reminds me of Roman emperors that loved to eat so much that they would get themselves to puke so they could eat more. It is something about it that just doesn't sit well with me.
Okay, thank you. So got some more questions here. And these are, I think, some challenging questions. So
Okay.
one is, this is clearly, I think, one just piece of a bigger puzzle in terms of addressing this, this very serious issue. Someone's asking about what about beyond households, companies? What about tracking what McDonald's and Amazon and Home Depot and other large industries are contributing to this crisis?
Yeah, it's a great question. And at the end of the day, we create a demand for these products, right? And it's up to us to vote with our demand as to which companies we support and don't support. And I would say to you, particularly in the choice of mutual fund or 401k investment vehicle, use that choice. Money speaks, money talks. I'll also say, Jeff, you look at a number of very large companies, and I'll give you examples: Google, Apple, IBM, Amazon, Starbucks, Vestas, have all declared to be net zero by 2030 or net zero by 2035. And there's a whole European coalition of companies that have made this pledge. So they are moving even faster than what we're asking the average public to do, which is to achieve net zero by 2040. And those companies that are not moving in that direction, I will argue, are doing so at their own peril. They will be both unpopular, but they will also have stranded assets that they wouldn't even know what to do once you know, you won't even be able to buy fossil fuels by the end of the decade, if you ask me. Things are changing very, very fast, right? So I think, Jeff, it's very easy to sit back and say the government should do more and companies should do more and Department of Energy should do more and my utility should do more. And you are right, they should all do more. But we should also look into ourselves, look in the mirror and say, am I doing everything I can in my control? Am I educated about these topics? And yes, if I can lobby my congressman, my senator, I should do so. And that can have a big impact, no question about it. But to me, each of us has the power to bring our households to single-digit carbon. Let's just do it. And the best part of it is, over a roughly 5 to 8 year period, the investments pay for themselves, right? So if we can afford to get started, let's do it. And even if we can't, there's low-hanging fruit like LED bulbs and insulation and community solar and so on. Let's at least do that, right? So the theme here is personal responsibility and accountability. It doesn't mean companies shouldn't do their part or government shouldn't do their part. We need all of the above.
I think you're answering a couple of these other questions, but it's along the same lines of individual changes and the impact those will have versus government policies and changes. And in terms of, somebody asked, in terms of basically the, I guess, the response that people have had to the pandemic and getting vaccinated, you know, how realistic is it to really be, you know, have a strategy that's based on individuals making, you know, the right choice or the responsible choice. So can you address that a little more? I know that's a tough question.
Sure, yeah. So I will begin by quoting Margaret Mead. She said something like, never underestimate the ability of a small group of committed citizens to change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that's ever changed the world. So it's our commitment that will change the world. Now, the pandemic has been just a terrible, terrible tragedy in so many different ways. And it's compounding the woes that we have due to climate change. In the case of the pandemic, we relied on a central solution being the vaccine, developed by some very smart people to get this disease under control. I don't think it's a similar crisis when it comes to climate change. Why? Because we wake up every morning, turn on the lights, turn on our car, and we emit carbon, right? And if we say to ourselves, that causes me stress, that causes me angst, I will not emit carbon. We can do that. We can feel empowered by doing that, and we can be part of the solution and not part of the problem, right? So I would really not. I totally understand that the pandemic has caused tremendous harm and loss of life and so on, but this battle remains to be fought, and we cannot afford to fumble it.
Thank you. So I know I'm still getting more and more questions here. I'm going to try to focus on ones that I can best direct to you. So do you find the carbon offsets for flights, for example, are real and actually help reduce carbon?
Yeah, the short answer is yes, they are surprisingly inexpensive. To give you an example, if I did an economy class round trip from New York to California and back, I could pay something like $16 or $18 and sleep well at night that those $16 or $18 will be used for some activity like capping a landfill somewhere that will reduce carbon by an amount equal to what was burned in my name to transport me to California and back. Now, if it's a family of four, then it's $70, $80 you're paying in addition to your ticket price. A lot of companies like JetBlue will allow you to just click a button when you're booking your flight to take care of the carbon offset. The carbon offset goes to companies that are regulated, that are audited, and they have to prove that they are reducing carbon by a certain amount. And there's so much low-hanging fruit for carbon that they're able to do it in an inexpensive way. So my point is we can't all be Greta Thunberg and get on a sailboat when we need to go somewhere, right? So you have to be practical. Take your vacation, do your business trip, go see your grandchildren, whatever you need to do, do it. But ask yourself if you can afford the extra $15 to offset that flight. And it may be more if it's overseas, but if it's domestic, that's about the maximum that you would pay for a carbon offset. So yes, I think you can be confident that that money will be used to reduce carbon somewhere in a meaningful way. And in the carbon tracker, we will allow you to get credit for that carbon if you offset it. Now, a lot of people say, well, if somebody puts renewable energy into the grid somewhere else and I'm consuming it from the grid, that's like cheating. If I pay money, that's different from actually reducing my carbon. And all of this is true, but we have to be practical and do what we can. And in that sense, I would say renewable energy credits in general, or things like community solar and clean ESCOs, they work. Somebody is putting clean energy into the grid somewhere in your name in order for you to get clean energy. Similarly, carbon offsets work. That money is used to reduce carbon somewhere, and it's audited very, very carefully by a third party to make sure that's true. So I say make full use of it and be practical, because otherwise all you have is a sailboat.
Another question, can you help us visualize what 59.5 tons of carbon dioxide feels like? Is that like 20 days of running your car in the garage, or is it a week sitting under a smokestack on the Jersey Turnpike? Is there some sort of visualization you can give us of what the 59.5 tons is like?
Yeah, I certainly can. It's compared to most countries, it's about 5 times as much as what a household would emit, including developed countries. So folks, we are being ridiculously, horribly, selfishly wasteful when we are emitting that amount of carbon. Now, there's different ways of trying to describe to you what 60 tons of carbon means, but imagine every day that we wait, right? We're adding to the load in the atmosphere. The CO2 that goes into the atmosphere, the molecules are a little bit like one-way mirrors. They allow sunlight to come through on the way to the earth. That sunlight hits the earth. Some of it bounces back and would normally just go back into space, but now it hits this higher concentration of greenhouse gases, and the one-way mirrors send it back to the earth. And that's why we get warming. That's the fundamental physics mechanism of why we're getting warming. Now, what is 1 ton of carbon, right? Well, a small car like a Fiat weighs about a ton, right? So it's that equivalent weight in gas. And there's a sculpture in the Netherlands that helps you visualize what 1 ton of carbon looks like, carbon dioxide looks like. And you can just Google Netherlands sculpture 1 ton of CO2 and you'll see it. It's this enormous giant cube, right? So imagine if every tailpipe of your furnace chimney, every tailpipe of every car had a balloon on it, and just captured all that gas, it would become so big and so enormous so quickly, right? It's obscene. So I don't have a good answer to help you visualize it. I'm just telling you that there's easy low-hanging fruit for us to cut it at least in half this decade. That should be a very trivial thing for us to do. Now, there are other countries where the carbon emission is so much lower. We're asking them as well to cut it in half, but frankly, that's a much harder problem for them than it is here. We are just so wasteful.
Okay. I have a couple more here, but I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Bob, who I think got some questions sent to him.
Sure.
Thanks, Jeff. It is, please comment on how to renovate and build houses. Passive house standards ought to be better known to the public and implemented, as they represent the highest energy standard with the promise of reducing the energy consumption of buildings by up to 85% in New York, while providing superior comfort and indoor air quality.
Good question. Thank you very much for that question. So in general, our building codes need to be upgraded in a big way. There are the so-called New York stretch codes. I don't know how far Port Washington is in adopting these stretch codes. And these stretch codes will require us to build homes that are more efficient, that have better insulation, that make use of sunlight to heat, and so on and so forth. Now, allow me for a moment to take a quick digression here. My journey into this renewable space, into this environmental space, it got accelerated in roughly 2007 when we were building a home. And I realized that the required codes are so trivial. There's no reason why it could not be a much higher code. And that's when I learned about solar panels and better insulation and efficient bulbs and heat pumps and so on. And thus began my journey to both quantify carbon and systematically do the step down of carbon in every aspect of life: food, composting, electricity use, transportation, etc., etc. And long story short, it was a roughly 12-year journey to get all the steps done. And I am more than reasonably satisfied that I'm at a very low number these days. And perhaps it could go a tiny bit lower too. Of course, there's always more room at the bottom, as fine men would say. But this is not something that anybody else could not replicate, right? We can all do this. And the carbon tracker is a good first step to go on this journey. And yes, if we can use passive solar, yes, if we can use better insulation, that just reduces the load on our heat pumps. And then you can get by with a smaller system. And that in turn means the efficiency is better, all goodness. So the key here is to adopt the stretch codes as the next step.
Okay, I do have a couple more questions here. I'm just going to remind everybody again, as I mentioned before, for those who are eager to go ahead and create a profile and use the Carbon Tracker app, if you're needing assistance with that, or if you need, if you know of someone who would like to also and doesn't have access to a computer or internet, the library does have public computers. We certainly can have our computer aid staff assist you with that. They have some of the instructions that I've provided to them for that. So a couple of more questions here. Someone asked, is there a list of companies available somewhere that is doing right and making those commitments to net zero carbon so we can support the right ones? Are there some resources you could direct us to?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think we in Cure 100 should do some more work on publishing some of these. So there is a list of companies that are called the RE100 companies. These are companies that have made a commitment to use 100% renewable energy before the end of the decade. And you can just Google RE100 and you will see that list of companies. Now, the problem is that we buy stuff all the time. We buy clothes, for example. And the garment industry is a big, big source of both chemical pollution, but also carbon impact, right? And there are definitely companies that produce these garments in a more sustainable way and those that don't, right? And what we need are experts in each industry to have some sort of process by which this information gets known for footwear, for electronics, for clothes, for everything, right? And we need to, reward companies that are trying to do the right thing by giving them our business and take away our business from the companies that are destroying this earth that is so beautiful and so precious to us. Unfortunately, I don't have some solution to just refer you to, a buying guide for everything that takes sustainability into account. However, the one thing I think everybody on this call should be aware of is that every stock and every mutual fund is rated by Morningstar with an ESG score. ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance. And this takes into account all the practices of the company and or the companies that make up a mutual fund. And if you only put your money in investments that have high ESG scores, you are encouraging the right companies with your money and your investment. And frankly, you're making a smart investment as well when you do that. So call your accountant, call your broker, make your 401k choices, and take ESG scores into account. Now, we need ESG scores for clothing, ESG scores for food, ESG scores for everything. And I think they're coming, but I don't have any nice resource to point you to, unfortunately. And Juliana, we might take this up as an area of study for CURE and break it up for different chapters to study different aspects of this question. It's a very good one.
Great. Another question. This is about using solar energy and solar panels on a home. Question really is, for some homes, that's just not a realistic option. What are the other alternatives to having solar panels on your home?
Great question. Thank you very much for asking that. If you're a renter, you can't have panels on your home. If your roof is shaded, your backyard is shaded, it doesn't work for you. If your roof's going to come up for repair in 3 years, it doesn't make sense for you to put a whole bunch of panels on there. The great news in all of this is that there are 3 other ways for you to get 100% clean electricity. One of those other ways is community solar. The way community solar works is that a developer builds a solar farm somewhere in the vicinity of your town or even outside of your town. You then basically kind of get a share of that farm, and that the amount of electricity you use, that equivalent amount of clean electricity is put into the grid by that developer. And you get an incentive that saves you 10% on your electric bill. So you save money and you're using clean energy and you are encouraging solar farms being built. So that's a way that you can get clean energy without your own solar panels. Another way to get clean energy is that these days you don't have to buy electricity from your utility. Your utility just maintains the poles and the wires for you. You can buy the energy from any energy supply company, and there are energy supply companies that guarantee you 100% clean energy. And in the old days, it was 2 pennies more or 3 pennies more per kilowatt hour for the clean energy. Now it's almost equal. And so there's really no overhead, financially speaking. You just make a choice to get clean energy, right? So there are, putting solar panels on your home is not the only way to get clean energy. There are many other ways of doing it as well.
Okay, someone asks, are there solar farms anywhere near Port Washington?
Juliana, this one is for you.
Yes, there are options. So Transition Town doesn't really want to promote one over the other, like the providers. But if you want to contact us, we can give you a name.
Great.
At least community solar available for Washington. Yes.
I will just mention that barely a quarter mile from where I live, we built a very large community solar project. It supplies about 50 homes with community solar. So we now have 50 homes that are getting 10% off their electric bill. The panels were put on the roof of the Department of Public Works building. So the village gets rent from its roof. So we're getting this additional income into the village. The developer is selling electricity and probably doing fine. And we, Croton 100, the chapter of Cure 100, signed up these 50 families to get community solar. And we got a very nice finder's fee or commission, if you will, that became a charitable contribution to our not-for-profit. I mean, talk about win, 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 win. We should replicate this across every town and village.
Great.
True.
Other...
So Jeff, I realize that we are actually way over, so maybe we need to wrap it up soon.
Sure. I think I have 2 more questions here. Let's see.
I love the questions, so don't get me wrong.
Yeah, we're okay. I mean, I appreciate everybody sticking around. And again, Shandu, I really have to give you a big shout out for taking the time to answer all of these questions. I appreciate you being thoughtful about that. Question, and again, it's related to your final slide here, which is some of the other work that Transition Town is doing. It's about recycling, and in particular about recycling of plastics, which again, it's not even the right word. It's it's downcycling. You're not making the same product again from that. Can you talk a little bit about that in terms of reducing plastic production or other alternatives?
Yeah, when it comes to plastic, we should just say no as much as we can. Now it's ubiquitous. Every toothbrush, every product has it. But at the very least, let's avoid single-use plastic. You don't use a straw and throw it away. You don't use a plastic spoon and throw it away. That's just no good. Take it home, wash it, use it 25 times, right? So we need to get away from this notion of single use as a first step. I'll give you one piece of statistic. July is Plastic-Free July. This is the month when we educate and advocate for people to reduce their plastic use. A lot of these microplastics get into our waterways. There are 51 trillion pieces of plastic in all the oceans and waterways of the world, which is 7,000 pieces of plastic for every man, woman, and child on this planet. That's how bad this stuff is. We've got to fight this. It has tremendous bad effects on aquatic life, amongst other things. So the short answer here is just say no. Carry your own bags, take your own containers, reuse containers, say no straw with that, please. We all know how to drink out of a cup. We don't need straws. If you really want a straw, take a bamboo straw from home. Just get a little bit more thoughtful about this. We can make an enormous amount of difference. And if you must use plastic, then recycle it properly. And at least the ones with a number inside the recycle, 1 through 6 or 1 through 7, can be recycled reasonably well. But there's lots of kinds of plastic, as you said, that don't get recycled well at all and are harmful anyway. So this is something we should be very mindful of. It is a byproduct of the fossil fuel industry, and I say no to fossil fuels and no to plastic. Just stop it.
And I'll just make a quick reference again. We did have a program, I think back in April, with the Michael Kelly with the town of North Hempstead, who manages the waste here in our town. He went through a whole long list of all the do's and don'ts and ins and outs of recycling. That recording is on our library's YouTube page as well. Two more questions that I have here. One is there a way to convert other things to collect in the energy, such as, let's say, the dryer vent output, or are there other things that are, generating heat or other things that could be turned into a way to capture that energy and reuse it?
Yeah, that's a great question. Just quickly on the previous question, our schools are a great place to start, because if you can get our school kids to pay attention, whether it's energy or carbon, plastic, whatever, they, first of all, educate their parents. And secondly, they are the future, right? So that's a wonderful place to start. And I see this September 24th event here about kids' cafeterias. And that's what we went after in Croton. And I'm happy to say we made a lot of progress there. And as kids, schools are a great place to start. And we're finally getting to electric school buses in our school. But let me get to your answer. There are so many things, Jeff, that we can do in our houses to reduce our energy load. And simply cleaning the air filters on our, forced air system, cleaning the filters of the lint out of filters when we use our dryer. That reduces the amount of energy that's needed. We all have vents or grates that are blocked at the back of a couch or whatever. Just give it some room for it to flow. We all forget to close the flue on our, fireplace chimney after the fire's finished, and heat is just escaping out there. So go to the carbon tracker, go to the heating section and read through all of the tips there, and you will get a lot of information. The best energy is negative energy. The best watt is a negawatt. The energy that you don't use is a wonderful thing. So yes, there's a lot of things we can do. And in the interest of time, I'll just point you to the My Carbon page of the Carbon Tracker in the heating tab.
Thank you. One last question here. Do you know if New York State has any laws or regulations about building along the waterfront, I guess, in terms of future sea rise and, is it to discourage, I'm sure, people from building so close to the waterfront?
I honestly do not have knowledge to answer that question, but anybody that builds along any waterfront these days needs an IQ test.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I'm sorry, but
no, I understand. I just a quick comment about the ways in which I believe PSE&G is now providing sort of like a report in addition to your bill. It's sort of a more detailed, this is the energy that you've been using, and it's really encouraging you basically to keep a little closer track of it instead of just, here's what you owe, here's what you're paying. Yeah, this is the total that you used. So again, I think, that there sounds like there are more tools coming down the pipe as far as ways that we can analyze and measure this usage. I don't have any other questions on my end. Bob, do you have anything on your end?
Jeff, really quick, my thanks to Heather Clark of Port Washington and to Lorraine Aguilar of Port Washington, who took our pledge live during this seminar. Thank you, guys.
Wow.
That's
No
terrific.
No questions here, Jeff.
Okay, thanks, Bob. Well, again, I think I want to just circle back around to the Margaret Mead quote that you shared with us. And I think it really is, again, it's everyone's responsibility, but there really is no measure of what a small group of dedicated people can do. And I appreciate all those dedicated people that were here for today's program. I want to thank Juliana, Shandu for a terrific program today. I want to thank Transition Town Port Washington and appreciate everybody taking the time. And again, Shandu, thank you for taking the time to answer all of these questions.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Bob. My pleasure. And thank you, everyone that stayed patiently for so long.
Yeah, and just let me add my thanks this year, and I encourage everybody to actually go do the carbon track app and learn about your household footprint. We have to be aware. Before we are aware, we can't really change what we are doing. So that's a really good step. And the Q100 pledge that Shandu just did a shout out to. So take that pledge, it's like, it's the first step when you sign up and say like, I'm doing this, that helps you actually sticking to it. So go to that, to the website and take a pledge. It's all on this page here. And of course, join the Transition Town mailing list. We have more programs coming up. We have the ones that are, putting us down a little bit, like Shandu's beginning part, and then lifting us up a little bit, like here's something we can do. We have both coming up. We have the climate projection maps of Long Island, July 28th. So you're going to see what's happening to our island. September 19th, we have a bike parade that's like organized to show like we can go away from cars if we show that we can bike and reduce the carbon like this in our peninsula, make it bike friendly. Come join us for that. And of course, the plastic issue on September 24th, the screening of the microplastic mandates that we have mentioned a couple of times. Plastic is just a real issue that we have to tackle. So join us for that too, just to learn more and see what we can do. More information on our website, of course, always. And we always looking forward to working with you. Contact us. I'd like to hear from you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Jed.
Thank you,
Shandu.
Juliana.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, I'm just going to throw out one last question here. It was one that was asked early on, and I happened to miss it and not circle back around to it. Question is, I've read that producing the batteries for electric vehicles produces more carbon than it saves over the vehicle's lifespan, and that the mining of rare earth materials, or minerals rather, for lithium batteries is also a carbon reducing process. So just going to end on a tough question there for you, Sean.
No, I love the tough questions, and we should all be asking tough questions. So I welcome that, Jeff. So I have multiple studies on this issue, and it's really a bit of a myth. The carbon impact of manufacturing a car, whether it's a gas car or an electric car, is roughly the same. The savings comes in the day-to-day use over the 10, 12, 14-year life of that car. So this business that it's somehow a higher carbon impact to manufacture is a myth. There are multiple scientific studies that have cleared up that question, Jeff, and if somebody wants, get in touch with me and I can point you to the reports. Having said that, the batteries require certain elements. There's not much cobalt needed anymore. It needs a little bit of lithium, right? And it's not a whole lot of lithium, but it needs lithium. And unfortunately, that's mined in less than human conditions in some places, and that's a problem. It's no different from how your socks get made or your t-shirt gets made in some parts of the world. That needs to get cleaned up. There's also a tremendous amount of research in new battery technologies, the new anodes that are being made. I mean, I could go on and on about the different things that are being tried. And battery technology has just been getting better and cheaper and safer and higher energy densities and lower weight, just year over year over year. It's one of those amazing things that's going to come and rescue us in so many different ways. So I'm not saying that mining lithium in subhuman conditions is a good thing. That's got to get cleaned up, but it's no different than your socks or your t-shirts being made in a fair way and the labor being paid properly. The amount of rare earths needed in these batteries is going down and down, and there are some batteries that don't need any, in fact, right? So I don't see that as in any way as red light or something that would stop us from making progress. In fact, batteries are going to be key to moving our grid to 100% renewables, because you only get energy when the sun shines and the wind blows. What do you do the rest of the hours? You've got to store that and give it back, right? And big banks of lithium ion batteries will solve that problem for us. So it's a bit of a red herring. I've heard that question before, but it's been very much refuted in the literature. And then the carbon impact of manufacturing is roughly the same for a gas and an EV.
Great. Well, thank you, Shandu, for taking the bonus question there. again, just want to thank everybody for spending some of your evening with us. And I want to again thank Juliana and Shandu. I'm hearing the announcement the library's starting to get ready to close for the night. But again, looking forward to future programs with you folks. And again, thanks for all your time tonight. Great program.